Are we ready?
Yes, we're ready, I think, for live.
Okay, so good evening to all. My name is Lucas Katsonis, and I am the chairman of Foreign Affairs Institute. I want to welcome you to this fourth live conversation about Kurdistan and its position in the region and beyond. In the first webinar of this series, the speaker was Mr. Salih Muslim of the PYD, and the discussion was under the theme of Syria under revision, the Kurdish perspective. The second one was for Kurdistan in international relations, and our guest speakers were Dr. Babar Mustafa from the University of Kurdistan and Mr. Seng Sagik, Chief Analyst of TAMC Solutions. Our third discussion was between Mrs. Zozana Lush, who is a member of Syrian Democratic Council, General Hajar Ismail, Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs, General Kino Gabriel, former spokesman of the SDF forces in Syria, and Mr. Yerevan Said, research associate of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. And the topic was the Kurdish role in a changing region. That means the strategic considerations, opportunities, and challenges. All three discussions were moderated by Dr. Marianna Charountaki from University of Lincoln, as is this case for today also. At this moment, I would like to thank Mrs. Bayan Abdulrahman, the KRG representative in the US, and Mr. Morgan Kaplan, who is fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and of course, Dr. Charountaki, whose efforts made this discussion possible. So our discussion today is about the effect of US-Kurdish relations on regional politics. And I thank you all once again. And Dr. Charountaki, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for making this event possible. On my behalf, I would also like to thank Bayan Abdulrahman from the KRG representation in the US for attending today, and also Dr. Morgan Kaplan. I do believe that this is an always topical, but at the same time important event on the US-Kurdish relations and its impact on regional politics. And I would also like to thank today our audience for attending this event. Bayan, I'm not taking your time. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Marianna. Thank you to the Foreign Affairs Institute, and Morgan, great to be with you as well. Thank you very much for this discussion. So the theme is US-Kurdish relations and the impact on the region. So I'd like to start really by talking about US relations with the Kurdistan region, US relations with the Kurdistan region in Iraq. So really, our relationship with the United States, I would say, began in 1991. Of course, there was a relationship before, but it wasn't in the same manner. In 1991, after nearly 2 million Kurds fled to the borders of Turkey and Iran, trying to flee Saddam Hussein's forces, the United States, Britain, and France came to their rescue with Operation Provide Comfort. And actually last year, 2021, was the 30th anniversary of that operation. And the operation lasted actually a few years. And then eventually the operation led, to the establishment of a no-fly zone over Kurdistan region in Iraq. And that's why I'm saying that really the root of our relationship today with the United States goes back 30 years. And it started as a military humanitarian Operation Provide Comfort, became a no-fly zone to protect the people of Kurdistan from Saddam Hussein. And then in 2003, when Iraq was liberated from Saddam Hussein, the Peshmerga forces were the only Iraqi forces that fought alongside the Americans to remove the regime. I know the Iraq war is controversial in the United States, in Europe, and even in Iraq. However, if you had been the victim of Saddam Hussein, his repeated acts of genocide, chemical bombardment, all with impunity, indeed it was a liberation in 2003. Then after 2003, our relationship has gone from strength to strength. I would say the Kurdistan region needs America and America needs the Kurdistan region. From our perspective in Kurdistan, why do we need the United States? The United States obviously has played a huge role in Iraq since 2003. And it's been important for us to have an open dialogue with America, with Washington, important for Washington and other partners around the world, in Europe, for example, to understand the Kurdish position. What is our position on certain events and developments in Iraq, regional developments, and even developments that impacted the United States and how that might impact Iraq. So we've been very careful to make sure that we have that open channel with Washington, whether here through our mission in Washington, DC, or of course through our high senior colleagues in Baghdad, Kurdish colleagues in Baghdad, and of course our high officials in Erbil, the president of the region, the prime minister of the region, deputy prime minister, speaker of parliament, and so on. Then I want to talk a little bit about Kurdistan's relations in the region. So, of course, we're part of Iraq. We're a sub-sovereign entity. However, our leaders are received at a very senior level by regional leaders, not only by Western leaders and leaders elsewhere, but also in the Gulf states, in Jordan, in Turkey, even in Iran, our leaders are received at the highest level. And I think this says a great deal about Kurdish diplomacy. It has shown that Kurdistan region has become an indispensable player in Iraq. Our influence perhaps is not as great as it was, let's say, in 2006 by comparison. However, we are still needed, very much so, in Iraq. If you look at the process of government formation right now, of course, there are some terrible things going on to delay that government formation. But without the Kurds, as well as without other important players, the government formation will not be able to be concluded. And that takes me to a broader point that I want to make about the Kurds in the Middle East. So, of course, as you know, there are Kurds in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. And estimates vary as to the number of Kurds in total from, let's say, 25 million to 45 million. Whatever the genuine true number, it's a large population in the Middle East that identifies itself linguistically, by heritage, by culture, by custom as Kurdish. And that needs to be respected. And I think increasingly it is being respected because of elections. If you look at Turkish elections, the Kurdish vote, whether it's in the mayoral elections in Istanbul or the general elections in Turkey, the Kurdish vote matters. If you look at Iraq, the Kurdish vote matters in Iraq. And so I would say what has changed both globally in our relationship with the United States, for example, but also regionally in the Middle East, is that you cannot ignore the Kurdish voice today as perhaps you could have 30, 40 years ago when Saddam was throwing chemical bombs at us, decreeing Anfal, a genocide against the people of Kurdistan. No one in the region stood up for the Kurds. Maybe they wouldn't today either, but today they would have to take note. Today, they wouldn't be able to just ignore the situation because the Kurds have a voice today that we didn't necessarily have in the past. One final point on the Kurdistan region, going back to the Kurdistan region, and that is oil and gas. So today, Kurdistan region of Iraq is exporting 400 to 500,000 barrels of oil a day. That's pretty significant. Some independent countries only export that amount, and we're a region and we're part of Iraq. We're developing our gas infrastructure, and we're using the gas currently domestically. But let's see where we are in a few years, and perhaps we could be an exporter of gas in the future. So I think that also makes Kurdistan region a very important player regionally and globally. And I would say even today, when we're very sadly looking at what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, and an issue that keeps coming up is Europe's dependence on Russian energy. I think it makes it even more important that Kurdistan's energy should be out there on the international market. So I'm not saying that we're replacing anybody, but we're an important player in the energy sector as well. So I'd like to end my remarks there. Very, very happy to answer as many questions as come my way later on. Or if you have any questions right now, of course, I'm happy to expand on anything that you'd like.
Thank you very much, Bayan. Morgan, would you like to follow up?
Yes, thank you so much. Well, first I want to say thank you so much to the Foreign Affairs Institute for hosting this. Dr. Marianna, thank you so much. And Representative Bayan, it's a pleasure to be joining you again. So I was asked to speak more on the US perspective of how the US-Kurdish relationship can affect regional politics. And the first thing I'll say, of course, is I don't work for the US government, and so my views are not representing the US government, but I'm going to do my best to try and explain kind of what probably the predominant view is within the policy world in terms of thinking towards Kurdish issues in the region. So I think it's worth saying just off the bat that in general, there is a strong, individual level moral support for Kurdish rights in the region, as well as for a close Kurdish relationship. I think it goes without saying that, especially in the last 8 years in the war with the Islamic State, I think the extent to which public opinion towards Kurdish issues has changed in a very serious way because of the role of Kurdish Peshmerga in pushing back the Islamic State during such a critical time. But as Representative Bayan said, is very, very important is, in a lot of ways that relationship has changed over time. It started, first as a sort of sympathy and humanitarian approach to the Kurdish issue in the 1990s, but I think it's fair to say that today it has shifted more towards an actual view as a strategic partner. In more broader issues in the region. So I think people do realize, for all the reasons Representative Bayan had mentioned, that the Kurds are regional players, more so in 2022 than they had been 30 years prior, and that's really important for how we understand this. But from the American perspective, I would kind of want to flip the question a little bit, because I think it actually helps kind of see how I think US policymakers view the issue. I think from the US policymakers' perspective, it's less thinking about how the US-Kurdish relationship affects regional politics and more the flip of it. How do regional politics affect the US-Kurdish relationship? And that's not to say that the relationship isn't important. It's critically important for reasons Representative Bayan said, and for the reasons of the Kurdistan regional government and other actors being a force for stability. But the relationship between the two is thought of, I think, in a slightly different way for two reasons. One is I do think there's a general sense that the relationship with the Kurds is a bit of a constant. And in some ways, it could be taken for granted here in Washington. Right, the KRG is always incredibly pro-American, even when there are ebbs and flows in the relationship, which there are. I mean, one only needs to go back a few years to 2017, which I think was an extremely low point in the relationship between the United States and the KRG after the Kurdistan referendum. There is still this sense that Kurdish actors in the region are still going to want a strong relationship with the US. Now, that's out of, I think, a couple of things that we could be honest about. One, I think, is it is partially about, a general appreciation for the United States that is historical, going back to the 1990s. But I also think it's because of complete practicality in terms of, well, even if the US treats you poorly, as it does on occasions, it is still one of the most powerful actors in the region who requires that kind of cooperation. And so there's this sense of, because the KRG and other Kurdish entities are still going to be reliant on the US, you don't have to necessarily think about the Kurdistan relationship as an end in and of itself. The second reason is kind of related, which is the Kurdistan region and Kurdish issues are seen in many ways, I think, in Washington, not as an end in and of itself in terms of there's a policy towards what the US wants out of its relationship with Kurdish entities, but it's often treated as a means to an end, right? What are our counterterrorism goals in the region? Yeah, oftentimes, I mean, I think it goes without saying that, the US views the KRG as a stabilizer for Iraq, right? As a unitary government. And that's the way it's viewed, as a way of achieving regional stability when it can. And so the result is that I think is that how the US treats its relationship with the Kurds is contingent on regional politics at the time, and not so much the other way around. Although for reasons I'll mention in a little bit, I actually think that that can change in the future and has changed a bit over time. I mean, I think I can give one example here is the relationship between the US and the KRG in 2014. I was in the Kurdistan region in the north when the Islamic State was on its offensive. I was there from June to August, and it was really incredible watching how the relationship between the US and the Kurds changed in that period of time. As all of you know on the call, by the end of June, the Islamic State was already at the borders, essentially with the KRG, and the KRG was in a difficult place. But what folks also recall is that despite the attempts by the KRG to get help and support from the US, it actually wasn't really forthcoming. It wasn't really coming, and people were very concerned why the US was kind of dragging its feet on it. But it wasn't until August, when Erbil was really threatened, that there was a change in the relationship. And the way I kind of have always viewed that is because it was in August, I think, that the United States realized that the KRG was essentially the vanguard in keeping Iraq as a whole stable, not about keeping KRG stable, but as keeping Iraq as a whole stable. In some ways, Erbil was keeping Baghdad safe. And so there was this sudden turn of now suddenly the Kurds warrant more importance in terms of the type of support we provide. But that's just an example of kind of how I think the relationship is more, how regional politics is going and how that affects the relationship. And again, I think the thing to emphasize here is none of this says that the relationship is not critically important. It absolutely is, for that very reason I just said. The US required Kurdish Peshmerga to maintain one of its most important policy goals in the region. It's just a way of thinking about where the kind of causal thinking sits. And so again, the importance is there both for moral and humanitarian reasons, but also for security reasons. I think most people know it's no secret that the United States wants to focus its attention predominantly on East Asia, and now, of course, with what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. However, it is not to be taken for granted that the only way the United States can do that is with strong, stable partners in the region and regional stability. And so even though the Middle East may be becoming a secondary issue from a grand strategic scale in the United States, the US requires a strong partnership in the region to make sure that what happened between 2011 and 2014 doesn't happen again. Because if it does happen again, then they're not going to be able to achieve their goals. So in a lot of ways, it's all just so deeply interconnected. Now, I also want to say, it's not to say that there aren't things that flow in the direction of how US-Kurdish relations then impact regional politics. Of course it does. In a lot of ways, it's a feedback loop. Regional politics influences how the US engages with the Kurds, and then how the US engages with the Kurds influences regional politics further. And once again, I think you can look again to the example of the war against the Islamic State. The US may have been pushed to vastly increase its cooperation and support for the KRG at that time, but it also had a big effect on how regional actors like Syria, Turkey, and Iran not only viewed and behaved towards the KRG, but also towards the United States. So there is this feedback loop that is incredibly important. So if we are seeing it from the American perspective, or at least how I've characterized the American perspective in terms of regional developments influencing the relationship, what are some things we can look at now, right? What are some regional developments that may impact the US-Kurdish relationship? I mean, one I think is very important, obviously the US-Iran negotiations over the JCPOA. how that goes will have a big impact, I think, on where the KRG finds itself in terms of pressure from Iran, but also, its value from the United States in terms of maintaining regional stability and being a balancer. The second is it's always in the back of my head, but what happens in Syria? And we talked very briefly about Rojava, but I think it is important. The Biden administration has shown that it is able to make hard decisions about withdrawals. And in the grand scheme of things, from a strategic standpoint, you could see a potential world where the Biden administration thinks, okay, we've ended the combat mission in Iraq. We have withdrawn from Afghanistan. Maybe Syria is next. But what that means is that's critically going to involve, I think, the KRG, right, as an important regional actor that's going to have to be part of some sort of kind of agreement on what it means for the US to leave. There's going to be a regional dynamic. And tied into this, of course, is changing US-Turkish relations. No one should ever make predictions about anything. But it's quite interesting what's going on in Turkey, especially with the lira. People are talking about the vulnerability of Erdogan. And if there were to be a new government in Turkey, how would that affect US-Turkish relations, which obviously would then affect US-Kurdish relations, both in Rojava and in Iraqi Kurdistan? And so I would look to those as potential elements, regional elements that would affect the US-Kurdish relationship. And the final one I'd say, of course, is as Representative Bayan, I think very importantly brought up, was energy. Especially what's going on right now in Eastern Europe and the potential changes in the energy market. I think it'll be really important to see how that affects things. Now, what can, I think, Kurdish entities do to kind of flip the question, force America to flip the question, to flip the relationship to thinking about US-Kurdish relations first, and then regional politics perhaps second? One is something I think that's already happening, right? And that's about the KRG and other Kurdish actors becoming quite literally regional actors. I think it's actually been quite incredible in the last 10 years or so, how the KRG and how other Kurdish entities have become global actors on a broader stage in a very transnational, formal way. I mean, all you have to do is see basically talks given at the Munich Security Conference, things like this. These are high level events where the Kurds are really operating in demonstrating their ability to be a conductor, a conduit of relations. And I think that's important. The second is I think what often keeps the Kurdish entities from being a regional kind of player or regional consideration is the cross-Kurdish competition. And that's both internally in the KRG, but also across borders. I think that if things like that can be resolved and settled, it helps raise the stature internationally and just generally the kind of power, the ability of Kurds to be seen as regional actors. And it also goes without saying that it makes sense to see Kurdish entities hedge a bit in terms of where they're getting their support. I think it's completely reasonable, given the current situation in the region, but it also will get the attention of the United States. And then finally, I'll conclude with just things I think that the United States should consider in terms of this relationship. One is I do think it would be valuable to have a more permanent diplomatic infrastructure focused on Kurdish issues. In a lot of ways, what was interesting about the war against the Islamic State was that there was a tremendous amount of constant diplomacy across borders involving Kurds. And now I think after the war, it's fallen back to this kind of state-to-state diplomacy. It doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of diplomacy going on. I just think that the extent of it has gone down a bit. But I actually think it was quite useful during the war that, for example, there was a special representative whose essential job it was to go back and forth. We're talking about Brett McGurk essentially here. I think it was a very useful role that he had held. And I also think it would be important for the US to clarify its intentions in terms of its support for various Kurdish entities. I think there's a lot of ambiguity that's baked into the relationship, and I think that's done for strategic reasons. But I think it could be helpful in general from the relationship to understand more about what the minimal level of support is going forward for US goals in the region. But I'll conclude there with my 15 minutes and just say again that we're looking forward to your questions and any sort of feedback, and I think it's going to be a great discussion. Thank you.
Well, yes, very informative. Thank you very much. I will try to just stimulate a little bit the debate that we'll be having, and then we will open the floor to the audience. Well, I think there are so many different issues, but I would like to just choose and pick. Maybe it would be beneficial to discuss a little bit more about how maybe the Kurdish side views the new sort of presidency, Biden, whether we are talking about any sort of shift, whereas there any particular intention or sort of remark that we need to bring up. Now, when it comes to Morgan, I think you reflected on the role of on the relations between the US and Rojava Kurdistan, and I'm wondering if from the US perspective you see more sort of like deeper engagement beyond the military, obviously, interaction on the political level. Already there are, I think, sort of official meetings ongoing, and it seems that there is a sort of like a very good sort of level of engagement beyond maybe the military. So there, if you have something to say. I pick up a little bit on this refocus on East Asia and Ukraine, and I'm wondering, and you as well focused on this inter and intra-Kurdish sort of differences. But, I'm wondering, when we are talking about an unresolved situation in Syria, when we are talking about a sort of like deep conflict between the US and Russia, would really inter-Kurdish sort of differences matter little when it comes really to how Russia could respond following what now is happening to Ukraine in the case of Syria? So I'm just wondering if really the sort of picture is bigger than that. And maybe the reason that we're talking more about the effects of this sort of interrelationship or regional politics is that because I have a sense, and maybe Bayan can sort of reflect on that, that when we're talking about the Kurdish relationships, either with Turkey or Iran, to a certain extent, we are talking about sort of a consolidated relations. You see like interactive relations since 2008 with Turkey, and constantly we're talking about like the deeper sort of engagement, even in times of crisis. And I mean, we saw that even in the case of the referendum, the border was not really closed when there was a tough sort of like stance all around. And at the same time, even though Iran is a difficult player to engage with, we see a very sort of steady engagement that it is happening consistently, especially throughout the past sort of years. So yeah, I was hoping that we can reflect on all this, and then we can open the floor to the audience, the questions. Thank you.
Representative Bayan, after you, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll just go with the last question that you raised, Marianna, about our relations with Turkey and Iran. So of course, Turkey and Iran border Kurdistan region. They have very large Kurdish populations as well. Many of us are linked by blood or marriage. So those borders, while they exist politically and on the geographic map at another level, they actually don't exist. We're all Kurds. We speak the same language. Many of the tribes are divided by the borders, or there's intermarriage crossing the borders. And I think those countries are all very much aware of that, and sometimes they're wary of that, not just aware. When it comes to our relations with Turkey and Iran, as I said, they're neighbors, but they're more than neighbors because of that broad Kurdish population that spills over the borders. Both are regional superpowers with different policies, of course, sometimes competing, other times cooperating. But I think for both of them, they need Kurdistan region in Iraq. They need us. For Turkey, Kurdistan region has been a buffer really since post-2003, when, let's say around 2006-07, the rest of Iraq was pretty much at civil war with itself. Kurdistan region was peaceful, stable, the economy was booming. And this provided a buffer zone for Turkey, and also provided an economic opportunity for many Turkish companies during that boom period, that decade from 2003 to around 2014. Besides that, I think for Turkey, more politically, Turkey sees itself as one of the leading Sunni Muslim countries of the region. So, of course, it would try to support the Sunnis in Iraq, but the Sunni Arab community, until very recently, didn't really have a coherent position. It didn't coalesce around a single leader. Today, that's changing with Speaker Halbusi, the Speaker of Parliament. He has been able to bring together a coalition that did pretty well in the recent Iraqi elections. So I think for Turkey, in the absence of a coherent Sunni Arab political entity, it was the Kurds that Turkey would try to influence within Iraq. We, of course, have our own strategy, our own policy vis-a-vis internal issues in Iraq, and then, of course, also what the neighbors are trying to influence. And of course, all of them trying to influence not only the Kurds, but the Arabs, the Sunni Arabs and the Shia Arabs and others. With regards to Iran, for Iran, Iraq is a critical country. It has a massive Shia population. There are historic links. There are the pilgrimages and so on. And I think for Iran as well, Iraq is an incredibly important entity, and the Kurds within Iraq are very important for Iran as well. So for us, how do we view it from Kurdistan region? First and foremost, we are a region within Iraq. So while we may have good relations with our neighbors, and we strive to have good relations with all of our neighbors, at the end of the day, we are part of Iraq. And we know that we need to be getting on with our lives within the borders of Iraq, and to make sure that Kurdish rights are recognized politically, administratively, and constitutionally. So whatever our neighbors may be doing to try to influence us, at the end of the day, we look to the solution from within Iraq. We're also very mindful of how Iraq and Iran influence other players within Iraq. I would argue that there are some players within Iraq that don't really believe in Iraqi sovereignty. They say they do, but every day they are the cause of Iraqi sovereignty being breached. And that is an area of great concern for us in Kurdistan. We want Iraq to be a sovereign state, to independently make its own policies and decisions, and we're not confident that that is always the case. So these are the tensions, the pull and the push that we as the Kurdistan region are mindful of every day as we proceed, whether it's on the economic well-being of Kurdistan or broader Iraq, or whether it's about government formation or something else. And with that, I'll hand back to you.
Perhaps after Morgan, you could reflect a little bit more as well on the sort of current administration and Kurdish perspective on that as well.
I'm sorry,
following, Morgan, you could also reflect maybe on the current administration and the Kurdish perspective on that.
The Biden administration?
Yes, please, yes.
Great, yeah, I mean, I think, so the Biden administration, I think there's kind of two things happening. One is, I think there is a very serious sense that they do want to deprioritize the region from a military standpoint. I do think it is sincere. I think the Biden administration, which deserves some credit for this, sees itself as making tough choices about where the US is going to expend its resources internationally. And it really does want to make this transitional shift. On the other hand, I do personally think that I think there were lessons learned from 2011 to 2014, right? The last time that the United States tried to wipe its hands of the region and move elsewhere, it got drawn back to a massive war against the Islamic State. Now, that's not to say that things are going to play out exactly the same way if the US is to completely shift its attention. But that's to say that I think that this time around, I think the Biden administration is taking the lessons from the Obama years in saying, okay, how can we successfully pivot ourselves militarily while also ensuring that our goals in the region stay the way they are and aren't threatened. And so that's why I think there is this heavy emphasis on partnerships. And I think that that is, of course, where the KRG comes in. There's this emphasis that, well, if you're going to turn away this time, you need to still rely on someone and others to ensure that your interests are kind of maintained. Now, while I think that those two things are simultaneously existing, I still think that the Biden administration has not gotten the actual policy of doing it right. I still think it's pretty muddied from a messaging standpoint, and I still think that they haven't done the best job in terms of explaining to regional partners what they're expecting from them, under what conditions, they will provide or not provide certain types of support, and also what the bare minimum of what the relationship is going to look like. I think there are strategic reasons for them to have ambiguity in terms of how they're going to behave under certain circumstances. But I do think it kind of puts us in a position where I think regional actors beyond the KRG, beyond Iraq, are all kind of saying, okay, we know what the US wants to do, but we have no idea what policy they're going to leave in place. How relations even beyond the military perspective are going to work. What about economic competition with Russia and China? Because the Chinese compete economically more than they do militarily in the region. And I think that, as of now, the Biden administration hasn't actually put out a very clear and expansive message on, okay, if we are going to transition our focus, this is the strong policy we're going to leave in place. And I do want to emphasize that it has to be a strong policy for the reasons I kind of mentioned earlier. Pivoting to East Asia or focusing on Europe is only possible and only works if you have a good policy in place in the region to make sure that America's interests are maintained. Without that, things can go in ways that will ultimately perhaps draw the US back in ways it doesn't want to. I thought the question about Rojava was really interesting, right? And that it is predominantly a military partnership and whether it's moving politically. My view, at least based on what I've seen, is it hasn't become more of a political relationship. It has mainly stayed in the military sphere. And I think it will largely continue to. And the thing is that, this is, I go back and forth on potential scenarios because there are so many, but it seems like if the US actually did want to change its position in northern Syria, it will have to start thinking about its views on the PYD and the SDF as a political actor, because ultimately there's going to need to be a political solution. Right? There's no military solution to this. And so that's going to require them to think of how they view Kurds and Rojava as political actors, how Turkey is going to potentially be involved in that relationship, if at all, as well as the KRG. So it's something that doesn't currently exist, but I think it should going forward. And finally, with the unresolved issues, I do think it matters. I do think part of it is like almost on the subconscious, I think, of international actors when they see the competition between the parties. It causes a kind of subconscious view of, okay, well, perhaps the relationship is more inefficient. It is not as efficient as it could be because of these kind of issues. But it also gets to the bottom line. I didn't think we'd necessarily be going in this direction, but I think one of the biggest reforms that can happen in the KRG is Peshmerga reform, and that's what the U.S. is always talking about. Having these integrated units that aren't necessarily part of the party, but part of the Ministry of Peshmerga. That's real. That's the bottom line for the United States and other actors who support the KRG in terms of, can you achieve the security goals that we're hoping you can? So in some ways, it's not so not so important, and it's more kind of just a bad look. But in other ways, it actually is really meaningful, I think, even when the U.S. does view it from a security standpoint. And then I'll just say, of course, that Representative Bayan's comments on the regional actors, I thought that was really insightful, and I appreciated hearing that. And so I look forward to kind of further questions.
Thank you. Bayan, would you like to reflect on IDA's presidency before we move on with the rest of the questions?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. So on the Biden administration, so it's a year, of course, now since the Biden administration has been in place. And we're fortunate in that there are many familiar faces working on Iraq. Brett McGurk, of course, Zahra Bell at the NSC, Joey Hood at the State Department, Barbara Leaf. I mean, many actors within the US administration who are familiar to us from the Obama administration, or even previously. And I think that does provide a level of comfort, because when the Biden administration came in, we were in the thick of COVID, everybody working from home and getting to know new members of Congress and new people in the administration has not been easy. Of course, they're available for meetings. I'm not saying that. We have access, we have good meetings, but meeting people over Zoom has, I think, some drawbacks. You can't really create a rapport with someone that you've never met purely by meeting online. So I'd say that has been a disadvantage. There has been less travel, both to Washington from Kurdistan and from Washington to Kurdistan. That is also partly to do with COVID, but perhaps other issues as well. So I think that there has been some impact on the relationship from that perspective. But just picking up on a couple of things that Morgan said on the Peshmerga reform, this is actually one of the key policy priorities for the Kurdistan regional government, and we're very thankful to the United States and some other partners. There are 4 partners in all who are advising the Ministry of Peshmerga on the reform program. And recently, some very important steps have been taken to bring in the party-oriented Peshmerga units under the umbrella of the Ministry of Peshmerga. So those steps have been very critical, and I think an important step. And definitely the reform of the Peshmerga, having one unified professional force at the end of the day, is what Kurdistan region needs, and we are working towards that. And we see US support and the support of other partners as essential. The Biden administration has described the relationship with the Kurdistan region as a strategic partnership, and we view it in the same way. As Morgan indicated earlier, it doesn't mean that we don't have our ups and downs or bumps in the road or disagreements. Of course, there are disagreements, but I would say the relationship has enough history, has enough trust that, yes, we can disagree enormously on certain things, but at the end of the day, we can bridge that gap and get on with what is necessary in the here and now. I should also add that the Biden administration remains absolutely committed to the enduring defeat of ISIS. I know that ISIS isn't in the headlines anymore as it used to be. Of course, it no longer has the caliphate, and that is a huge achievement for all of the players, including the Peshmerga forces who fought so bravely against ISIS. But as a terrorist organization with sleeper cells, criminal activity, which is one of the ways that they get money, holding people to ransom and so on, ISIS is still very much a player, unfortunately, in Syria and in Iraq. And we need the United States and the coalition led by the United States to maintain its focus on ISIS. That's very important for us. And the strategic partnership includes that, includes the fight against terrorism, includes the reform program for the Peshmerga, includes the stability that Morgan has spoken about in the wider region and within Iraq. Of course, the State Department should speak for itself, but I think those are areas that both Erbil and Washington see our partnership continuing. And all of the things that I've just said apply to the Biden administration from where we're sitting. This is how we believe they see our partnership, and this is how we see it.
Thank you very much for your insights. I think it's very useful for for what is going on, and maybe to have a better sort of insight from within, so to speak, vis-a-vis the developments. I think Stefan has one question from the audience. Stefan, would you like to pose your question?
Yes, hi there. I'd like to ask a question regarding energy. That Bayan mentioned the strong energy sector in Kurdistan. Was just wanting to know what if there are any plans to develop a renewable energy sector, and secondly, would the US partner in terms of helping develop a renewable energy sector in the Kurdistan region?
That's a great question. Thank you, Stephen. Absolutely, we're very interested in renewable energy, and there have been many experiments, I would say, over the past 15 years with solar energy. Not so many of them very successful, but I think now we're beginning to see some successes. But we definitely appreciate the emphasis on climate change that the Biden administration has put at the heart of its foreign and domestic policy, because Iraq is one of the biggest victims of climate change. I think it's the UNDP, I don't remember which department of the UN, issued a report not long ago saying that Iraq was the 5th at most risk country in terms of climate change. Some of that is regular climate change that affects everybody. Some of it is man-made, either the legacy of Saddam Hussein's policies, for example, draining the Arab marshes, diverting rivers, and so on. And then, of course, all of the chemical bombardment and other ordnance that he sent everywhere. And then the third, which is more recent, which is pretty bad planning, I'm afraid to say, in Kurdistan and elsewhere in Iraq. So I would say climate change is a huge issue for all of us in Iraq. Iran and Turkey are building dams and diverting rivers, which is also impacting river flows in Kurdistan region and all of Iraq as well. So this is a conversation that I have had with many friends here in the Biden administration, to say that we're delighted that you have put climate change at the heart of your policy. And please, we need your assistance, whether it's financial, technical, or partnerships. Partner with us so that we can mitigate climate change and learn how to use renewables to better effect than we have so far. And I say there is interest. I can't really point to a specific project right now that's happening on the ground, but when I have raised this, there has been interest certainly from the Biden team.
Marianna, can I possibly build on Bayan's points? Because I think they're really important. I think especially the points at the end about water are really, really important, both from the energy perspective and the climate perspective. And on another area where I think that the KRG could use international investment in a very constructive way, and that's in agriculture. The KRG's ability to have a strong agriculture sector is really there, and they all go hand in hand. The ability to have renewable energy from hydroelectricity, but also to stem off the worst parts of climate change, which have been quite bad and have affected the region very much so. I mean, even this year, I believe it was, where you have this drought and then you have rains and the floods suddenly become the bigger issue. But I think that's really somewhere something I would be interested to see is kind of cooperation from governments like the United States, but also with the private sector on thinking about holistic plans for addressing energy diversity, climate change, and agriculture at the same time, because there's such incredible opportunity and a need for it. And it's the water issues, I think, that go hand in hand with it. So I just kind of wanted to build on that, because it's something I've always seen. And usually when I'm in the region, I always think to myself how important it is from the KRG strategic perspective that, when you buy a tomato, it comes from the KRG and not from Turkey or Iran. It's more than just about trade. It's more than just about, renewable energy. It's also about leverage in politics and your ability to be self-sustaining. And I think there's just such an area of overlap here where international investment can help solve a lot of different interconnected issues. And water is a key area of it with climate change.
Thank you very much. One more question that we have is again on Iran, and the question is focusing mostly on, it has two it's there two in one basically. One is on the sort of recent, especially after the referendum and the friction there was in there, we had a new sort of reality with this sort of opening of an economic zone on the borders between the KRG and Iran. So the question is whether this is an economic opportunity for both intentions and so forth. But equally, the importance of this triangle, US, Iran, Iraq, and when we're talking about Iraq, or equally, we're talking about both parts, central government and the KRG. So a few words on that, possibly?
Thank you. So yes, I mean, right now the United States is engaged in negotiations in Vienna, and we're all watching them with great attention to see how that evolves. Both Iran and the United States, of course, have enormous influence in Iraq. Perhaps today, Iran's influence is more visible. Iran, I would say, bets on every horse. It's a phrase I've used before. But Iran doesn't only have good relations with the Shia Iraqis, but also with the Kurds, with the Sunnis, and with others. And I think Iran invests in all of them. And then when the time comes, it needs one or other player, it pushes them forward. I'd say the United States plays the game differently. The US has invested enormous capital, blood, treasure in Iraq over the past 20 years or so. And I think for America, Iraq means something else. It's not a bordering country, but it's a place where a great deal of American capital, by that I mean political capital as well as treasure, has been spent. And so it has a significance of its own. Also, Iraq and Iraqi stability is important for the wider region. There aren't, well, how many democracies are there in the Middle East? So I think for some, it's very hard to accept that Iraq could become a fully fledged democracy and a thriving economy. And while some may say they want that, but at the same time, they're fearful of a truly economically successful Iraq that is a strong democracy in the heart of the Middle East. So I think there are actors that may push that forward and then at the same time try to drag Iraq back when it comes to those particular issues. For us in the Kurdistan region, we want to have a good relationship with Iran. As I said earlier, we border Iran. The rest of Iraq also has an enormous border with Iran. It's an important regional superpower. Economically, we do an enormous amount of trade with Iran and Turkey. They are Kurdistan region's biggest trade partners. So, of course, we want that trade to continue. At the same time, we want to be able to make decisions for ourselves, and we want Iraq to be a sovereign state that makes its own decisions as well. So I think this is where sometimes the tension lies. But we're not the only ones in Iraq who have that view. There are many of all colors and stripes in Iraq that share that view. Perhaps one last thing on the US, Iran, Iraq triangle. Quite often you really see that come to the forefront when it's time for government formation. So after an election, this is when the neighbors try to influence things in Iraq, and Europe, the United States, they also try to influence. Everybody does it differently. Some are very prominent, vocal, visual, visible. Others are more quiet. But the fact is, whenever there is an election that goes on, at the end of the day, the decision is Iraqi. It always has been finally made by Iraqis, even if the pull and the push was made by others. So we'll wait and see how it works out this time.
Thank you very much. And a final question with regards to the stability and the need Iraq to be further sort of stabilized. How do we see the role of the US in this sort of interrelationship between the central government and the KRG?
Well, I think Morgan spoke about this very well earlier when he talked about the US seeing Kurdistan as a stabilizing factor in Iraq and perhaps even further afield. And I think that still holds true. The United States made it very clear in 2017 that it didn't want an independent Kurdistan, at least at that time, or for the foreseeable future, but it wanted a Kurdistan region that was strong and economically viable. And we are holding America to its promise that this is what America wants for us, and this is indeed what we want as well. And so I would say the relationship continues along those lines. The United States wants Iraq to remain as one territory with Kurdistan within it. We want to make sure that our constitutional rights are protected. We've seen an erosion of that recently by some of the decisions that have been made by federal institutions in Baghdad. And we hope that the international community will stand by us, because without our constitutional rights being protected in Iraq, within Iraq, Kurdistan region will struggle. And if Kurdistan region struggles, then Iraq will struggle. There may be some Iraqis who may think that, you know, a collapse of the Kurdistan region will work in their favor, but I think they're greatly mistaken, gravely mistaken to think that way. A stable, economically prosperous Kurdistan region is in the interest of the rest of Iraq, and stability and economic prosperity in the rest of Iraq is in the interest of the Kurdistan region as well.
Thank you, Bayan. I think this is the very nice conclusive remark of whatever we're trying to say today vis-a-vis this interesting topic that it is in progress, and of course vis-a-vis the ongoing developments in the region. I think there will be a mutual sort of effect, as Morgan previously mentioned. I would like to thank both of you, our distinguished guests for today, for their insights, for their useful contributions, Bayan Abdulrahman and Morgan Kaplan. I really hope that these sort of discussions will keep going on in the near future, and let us wish as well that the world will turn more peaceful and coexistence will really sort of prevail over sort of conflict and chaos. So thank you very much, and I would like to thank all of you for attending this event today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Have a good day.
Thank you ever so much.